4 years ago, I watched the earth open up and swallow a man whole. Not crack, not crumble, swallow him like water, then seal shut without a seam. You think the ground beneath you is solid, right? You build your whole life on it. But I'm a geotechnical inspector. I spent 12 years measuring soil and bedrock, and I'm telling you, it's not solid. It's a skin, and something underneath it is listening to every vibration we make. I know because I broke its rhythm, and I'm the only one who walked away. You want to know how a guy who reads soil samples for a living ends up living in a van, terrified of his own heartbeat? Well, it started with a routine call. When the earth decides to swallow something, it usually leaves a mess. I've seen it. Fissures spiderweb across the asphalt, water mains burst, the dirt slumps inward like a collapsed lung. Subterranean water dissolves limestone over centuries, a cavity forms, the crust gets too thin, and gravity collects its debt. It's violent, chaotic, but entirely predictable. You can measure the math behind it. Or at least, I always believed you could. It was 104 degrees outside. I remember that clearly. The dashboard thermometer in my county truck was reading 104, and we were driving through this sun-baked valley basin in the alpine backcountry. Used to be a mining and logging hub decades ago, but the veins dried up. Now it was just blinding sunlight, cracked two-lane highways, and this chalky white dust that coated everything. The glare off the hood was bad enough to make my eyes ache behind polarized lenses. Dale was in the passenger seat. He just chewed on a wooden toothpick, staring out the window, not saying a word. Dale was my lead driller, a heavy machinery operator. 30 years of hands-on experience. He didn't trust the digital readouts on my screens, he trusted his gut. He was quiet, pragmatic, and he had this uncanny instinct for when a site was unsafe. Right then, his posture was rigid. He'd been tense ever since we turned off the main interstate and headed down into the basin. Vince, the county liaison, had called us out about 3 hours earlier. Vince was basically a politician in a hard hat, desperate to keep the local infrastructure intact so the state funding didn't dry up. His voice on the radio had been tight, artificially calm. He told us there was a severe road dip at the old four-way intersection near the abandoned limestone quarry. Wanted me to bring the ground-penetrating radar and the core drill to see if the road needed patching. I expected a pothole, maybe a busted culvert, but I slowed the truck as the intersection came into view through the heat shimmer off the blacktop. I hit the brakes, stopped about 50 yards back. There was no dip. Dale stopped chewing his toothpick. He leaned forward, bracing his thick hands against the dash. "Hutch," he muttered, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Tell me my eyes are just getting old." "They aren't," I said. I put the truck in park, left the diesel engine idling. The four-way intersection was just gone. Where the two roads were supposed to cross, there was a hole. But it wasn't a sinkhole. It was a perfectly circular, sheer-sided shaft dropping straight down into blackness. It spanned the exact width of the intersection, clipping the corners of the asphalt with mathematical precision. I grabbed my clipboard and pushed my door open. The heat hit me like a physical wall, and the air smelled wrong. Out there, you expect dry pine, baked dirt, maybe hot engine oil. Instead, it was thick with ozone, like the smell right after a lightning strike or a blown transformer, mixed with that chalky, suffocating scent of pulverized limestone. I walked toward the edge, my boots crunching on the gravel. Dale followed, carrying the portable core drill by the handles. "Don't get too close to the rim, Hutch," Dale warned. "If that's a washout, the overhang could be unstable." "There's no overhang," I said. I stopped about 5 feet from the drop-off. I crouched down, wiped the sweat stinging my eye. I stared at the edge of the asphalt. It looked like a massive cookie cutter had just punched through the earth's crust. The cut was flawlessly smooth. No crumbling debris, no jagged pavement hanging by rebar, no sheared pipes. The painted double yellow line just terminated cleanly at the void. "Where is the rubble?" Dale asked, stepping up beside me. "I don't know," I said. I felt a cold knot in my stomach despite the heat. When a cavity collapses, the displaced earth has to go somewhere. It falls inward, makes a debris cone. The sides should be sloped. This is a 90-degree vertical drop. It defies every principle of soil mechanics. "Look at the rock." Dale pointed a calloused finger down into the shaft. Below the asphalt, the exposed bedrock of the walls was completely uniform. Pale, chalky gray. "Set up the drill," I told him, standing up. "I want a core sample right here. I need to see what the structural integrity of this limestone is." Dale nodded, his face grim. He lugged the rig about 10 feet from the edge and fired up the 2-stroke motor. That loud, abrasive mechanical roar shattered the silence of the valley. He engaged the diamond-tipped bit, pressed it down into the earth. I watched his arms flex as he applied pressure, but his brow immediately furrowed. He eased up, pressed down again. "What is it?" I shouted over the noise. "No resistance," Dale yelled back. "It's biting into the bedrock, but it feels like I'm drilling through warm butter. This isn't right, Hutch." He killed the motor. The sudden silence left a ringing in my ears. Dale cranked the lever, pulled the hollow drill string back up. He unthreaded the core barrel and slid the cylindrical rock sample out onto the tailgate. I pulled a magnifying loupe from my vest and leaned in close. Bedrock in this region should be heavily fractured, full of natural fissures, crystalline deposits, maybe a fossil or two. It should have that brittle, dense texture of ancient compressed sediment. This core was perfectly smooth, highly porous, almost like a dense sponge. No natural striations at all. I reached out and rubbed my thumb against the side of the stone cylinder. It didn't feel like rock. It felt exactly like wet, heavy sand that had been instantly flash-frozen into a solid state. "It's like it was dissolved," I murmured, mostly to myself. "The molecular structure is completely uniform. Whatever created that hole didn't dig it out. It liquefied the stone." Dale didn't answer. I looked over at him. He had walked back toward the cab of the truck and was standing perfectly still, his head tilted slightly, listening. "Dale?" I asked. He held up a hand, gesturing for me to be quiet. He stepped toward the idling truck, reached through the open window, and turned the ignition key. The heavy diesel engine sputtered and died. "Listen," Dale said softly. At first, I heard nothing, just the blood rushing in my own ears. Then, I felt it. It wasn't a sound you could hear with your eardrums. It was a deep, subsonic vibration coming up through the soles of my heavy work boots. A rhythmic, pulsing hum that resonated directly in my bones. It made my teeth ache. The fluid in my inner ear began to spin, sending a wave of nausea washing over me. "The truck's engine," Dale said, his voice tight. The ground was humming in time with the pistons. When the truck idled down, the ground idled down. It was syncing up with the vibration. "That's impossible," I said, fighting down the sour taste of bile. "Sympathetic resonance happens in suspension bridges or glass, not in solid tectonic plates. You can't vibrate bedrock." "I know what I felt, Hutch," Dale said, taking a deliberate step back from the edge. "This place is wrong. We need to pack up. Call Vince on the satellite phone and tell him to get the state troopers out here to barricade this junction. We are out of our depth." I looked down at the smooth, porous core sample, then over at the impossible, perfect circle cut into the earth. My rational mind was screaming at me to find a logical parameter, a measurable metric that could explain this. I couldn't just walk away and write magic hole on an official county geotechnical report. "Give me 10 minutes, I said, walking around to the side compartment of the truck. "I need to see the bottom. I need to know how deep this goes and what happened to the displaced mass." "Hutch?" Don't, Dale warned. 10 minutes, I repeated, pulling the heavy, impact-resistant case from the truck bed. I unlatched the case and lifted out the commercial inspection drone. It was a heavy-duty quadcopter with a high-definition low-light camera, a laser depth scanner, and a reinforced tether line just in case of signal loss underground. I powered on the remote console, waiting for the telemetry data to sync up. The screen flared to life, fighting the blinding glare of the midday sun. I carried the drone to the edge of the shaft. The subsonic hum in the ground was faint now, a barely perceptible tickle against the bottoms of my feet, but the smell of ozone was growing stronger, burning the inside of my nostrils. I set the drone down on the asphalt and engaged the rotors. The high-pitched whine kicked up a small cloud of chalky white dust. I pushed the joystick forward, piloting the drone out over the center of the dark shaft, and began the descent. I kept my eyes glued to the monitor strapped to my chest rig. The camera feed showed the perfectly smooth, gray walls sliding past as the drone dropped deeper into the earth. 50 feet. 100 feet. The sunlight faded quickly, replaced by the stark, sterile glare of the drone's mounted floodlights. The walls remained flawless. No root systems poking through, no groundwater seepage, no geological layers of shale or sandstone. Just an endless, seamless cylinder of that pale, dissolved-looking rock. 200 feet. 300 feet. Signal is holding, I called out to Dale, my voice echoing slightly in the oppressive silence. The walls are completely uniform. Just find the bottom and bring it up, Dale replied, pacing near the truck. He was constantly scanning the surrounding desert basin, looking for something he couldn't name. At 380 feet, the depth gauge on my screen began to flash, indicating an approaching solid surface. I'm nearing the floor, I said, slowing the drone's descent to a hover. I tilted the camera gimbal downward. The floodlights illuminated the bottom of the shaft. Just as I had feared, there was no pile of rubble. No shattered asphalt, no dirt, no crushed gravel. The bottom was a perfectly flat, seamless floor of smooth gray stone. It's flat, I muttered, shaking my head. It's completely flat. The displaced earth just vanished. I engaged the lateral thrusters, panning the camera across the floor. The floodlights swept over the gray expanse until the beam caught the dull reflection of twisted yellow metal. I found the intersection infrastructure, I said, leaning closer to the screen, squinting. It was the heavy steel pole and housing of the four-way traffic light that used to hang over the junction. But it wasn't lying on the stone floor. It was standing perfectly upright. I piloted the drone closer, hovering just 10 feet above the object. The camera brought the image into sharp, terrifying focus. The traffic light wasn't resting on the rock. It was embedded inside the solid stone floor. The rock around the base of the metal pole wasn't fractured or broken. It was molded perfectly around the steel. As I watched the live feed, my breath caught in my throat. The traffic light was moving. Very slowly, millimeter by millimeter, the thick steel pole was sinking downward into the solid bedrock. It looked exactly like a heavy coin, dropping through a vat of thick, gray mud. The solid stone was yielding, swallowing the metal, and then seamlessly closing back up over it. Dale, I whispered, the rational foundation of my entire career cracking apart in my mind. The rock is acting like a liquid. The moment the words left my mouth, the subsonic vibration returned. It didn't come from the truck this time. It surged up from the earth beneath my boots, vastly more powerful than before. A violent, rhythmic pulse hammered through my skeleton. My molars ground together involuntarily. The drone's telemetry screen began to violently glitch with static interference. "Hutch!" Dale yelled, his voice cracking with genuine panic. "Get away from the edge! Now!" I looked back down at the monitor. The depth gauge still read 400 feet, but the camera suddenly tilted as the drone was caught in a massive downdraft of displaced air. Through the static-laced video feed, I watched the flat stone floor at the bottom of the shaft begin to shift. The seamless, solid bedrock was spiraling inward, sliding apart in overlapping geometric plates like the massive mechanical shutter of a camera lens, revealing a second, infinitely deeper void underneath. The monitor strapped to my chest rig screamed with static, but the image burned into my retinas was unmistakable. The darkness beneath those sliding plates was so absolute it seemed to absorb the drone's floodlights entirely. Then, the downdraft hit. The heavy-duty quadcopter, built to withstand alpine crosswinds, didn't even have time to compensate. It was sucked downward into the secondary void like a stone dropped in a vacuum. The telemetry data on my screen vanished, replaced by a glaring red error message indicating a catastrophic altitude loss. I grabbed the reinforced tether line connecting the drone to the surface. I wrapped it around my gloved hand and hauled back with all my weight, desperate to save the equipment, desperate to pull some piece of physical evidence back up to the light. The line went taut, singing with tension. It felt like I had hooked a speeding freight train. The tether snapped. The sound was a sharp, violent crack that echoed across the baked valley basin like a rifle shot. The sudden release of tension threw me backward onto the asphalt. I scrambled to my knees, staring at the frayed end of the yellow cord resting a few inches from the sheer drop. It hadn't just broken under the strain. The end of the line was perfectly smooth, sheared off at a molecular level, just like the rock cord Dale had pulled from the shoulder. The subsonic vibration in the ground, which had been a low, unsettling hum, suddenly amplified into a physical assault. It surged up through the asphalt, bypassing my ears and resonating directly inside my skull. My vision blurred as the fluid in my eyes vibrated. My teeth clattered together, and a wave of intense, crippling nausea twisted my stomach into a knot. This wasn't the rumble of shifting tectonic plates or the deep groan of a settling fault line. Tectonic shifts are chaotic. They are messy, jagged releases of pent-up kinetic energy. This vibration was rhythmic. It was a sustained, harmonic frequency, pulsing with the steady, deliberate cadence of a massive, subterranean heartbeat. "Hutch! On your feet!" Dale's rough hands grabbed the harness of my safety vest, hauling me upright. His face, usually a mask of weathered indifference, was pale beneath a layer of chalky dust. He didn't look at the hole. He didn't look at my ruined monitor. He looked at the surrounding desert, his eyes wide and tracking unseen threats in the blinding glare of the midday sun. "My gear," I stammered, disoriented by the pulsing hum in my bones. "The radar array, the drill rig." "Leave it," Dale commanded, his voice leaving no room for debate. "We are leaving. Right now. Get in the truck." I didn't argue. The rational, analytical part of my brain, the part that had spent 12 years documenting soil shear strength and groundwater erosion, was completely paralyzed. There was no mathematical model for a square mile of solid bedrock opening like a mechanical iris. There was no scientific precedent for a harmonic frequency that could liquefy limestone. I practically fell into the passenger seat of the county truck. Dale slammed his door shut, threw the transmission into drive, and stomped on the accelerator. The heavy diesel engine roared, the dual rear tires spinning and spitting gravel before finally catching traction on the hot asphalt. We rocketed away from the missing intersection, leaving tens of thousands of dollars of specialized county equipment sitting abandoned on the shoulder. I cranked the air conditioning to maximum, but the air blasting from the vents felt like it was being funneled directly from a blast furnace. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unbuckle my chest rig. I tossed the useless monitor onto the floorboards. "We need to call Vince," I said, my voice sounding thin and reedy over the roar of the engine. I reached for the satellite phone mounted on the dashboard. "We need to tell him to evacuate the basin. Whatever is happening back there, it's not a localized subsidence event. It's systemic. It's active." I pulled the handset from its cradle and dialed the emergency county dispatch number. I pressed the phone to my ear, waiting for the digital beep of the satellite uplink. Nothing. I checked the digital display. The screen was completely blank. I tapped the power button, held it down, even popped the battery out and shoved it back in. The device was dead. I pulled my personal cell phone from my pocket. It was a brick. The screens weren't just off. They looked as though the internal circuits had been completely fried. "Phones are dead," I reported, a cold sweat breaking out across the back of my neck. Both of them. The electromagnetic interference from whatever is generating that frequency must have wiped them. Dale didn't say a word. He just kept his foot buried in the accelerator, pushing the heavy utility truck past 80 miles per hour down the narrow, winding two-lane highway. The landscape whipping past my window was a blur of bleached white rock, stunted scrub pine, and cracked earth. "Where are we going?" I asked, gripping the grab handle above the door as the truck leaned precariously into a sharp curve. "Ocotillo Springs," Dale replied, his eyes locked on the road ahead. "It's a mile and a half down this highway. There's an old gas station, a diner, maybe a dozen modular homes. We warn them. We get them out, and we don't stop driving until we hit the interstate." I nodded, trying to focus on the mission, trying to force my brain back into a state of professional competence. Warning civilians. That was a tangible goal. That was something I could process. But the earth wasn't done with us. About a mile down the road, the deep subsonic hum returned. It didn't just fade back in, it swelled up from beneath the highway, vibrating the heavy steel frame of our truck. I felt it in the seat cushion, in the floorboards, in the plastic dashboard panel. Then, I noticed the engine. The heavy, rhythmic thrum of the diesel cylinders was changing. It wasn't the steady, predictable combustion of a working machine. The engine's revolutions were surging and dropping in a bizarre, undulating pattern. I looked over at Dale. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles stood out like thick cords. He was staring down at the steering wheel. I followed his gaze. The thick plastic rim of the wheel was vibrating violently in his hands. "Dale, the engine," I said, the panic finally breaking through my professional facade. "It's not the engine," Dale growled, his knuckles white. "It's the ground. Listen to it, Hutch." I closed my eyes and focused on the sound. He was right. The deep, planetary hum radiating from the bedrock wasn't just a random vibration. It was a specific, rhythmic frequency. And the heavy, mechanical thumping of our diesel engine was perfectly matching that rhythm. The earth was syncing up with our truck. It was as if the subterranean frequency was a predator, and the mechanical vibration of our engine was a beacon, drawing it directly toward us. The hum grew exponentially louder, shifting from a physical sensation into a deafening, low-frequency roar that threatened to shatter the truck's windows. "Turn it off!" I yelled, reaching across the console toward the ignition key. "Dale, shut the engine down! It's tracking the vibration!" Dale swatted my hand away. "If I shut it down, we lose power steering and brakes at 80 miles an hour on a mountain road. We're almost to the settlement. We just need to clear this ridge." The truck crested a blind rise in the highway, the tires briefly catching air before slamming back down onto the asphalt. The suspension bottomed out with a bone-jarring crunch. Dale fought the steering wheel, keeping the heavy vehicle centered on the road as we descended into the shallow bowl where Ocotillo Springs was located. I braced myself against the dashboard, preparing to see the rusted metal roof of the gas station, the faded neon sign of the diner, the scattered cluster of sun-bleached trailers. I was already forming the words in my head, planning how to explain the impossible danger to the locals without sounding like a lunatic. Dale slammed on the brakes. He stood on the pedal with both feet. The anti-lock brakes engaged, stuttering violently as all 4 heavy-duty tires locked up. The truck skidded sideways, the smell of burning rubber instantly overpowering the scent of ozone. We slid down the highway, drifting toward the shoulder, the world spinning in a chaotic blur of white dust and blinding sunlight. The truck finally came to a violently abrupt halt, the front bumper hanging mere inches over an edge that shouldn't have been there. I was thrown hard against my seatbelt, the coarse webbing biting into my collarbone. I gasped for air, the dust swirling around the cab, obscuring my vision for a few seconds. When the air finally cleared, I looked out through the windshield. The words I had prepared died in my throat. My mind simply refused to process the visual data my eyes were sending it. Ocotillo Springs was gone. The gas station, the diner, the dozen modular homes, the rusted pickup trucks parked in the dirt lots, the ancient towering cottonwood trees that had provided the only shade in the valley, all of it was erased. In their place was a crater of incomprehensible proportions. It spanned acres. It was so massive that the opposite edge was distorted by the heat shimmer rising from the basin. Just like the hole at the intersection, it was perfectly circular, and the edges were flawlessly smooth. The two-lane highway we were driving on simply ended at the precipice, sheared off cleanly. I slowly unbuckled my seatbelt and opened the door. My legs felt like lead, trembling uncontrollably as I stepped out onto the asphalt. Dale was already out of the truck, standing near the front grille, staring out over the abyss. I walked up beside him. The scale of the destruction was paralyzing. If a massive sinkhole had swallowed the town, there would be a sloping depression. There would be roofs poking out of the dirt, shattered walls, the chaotic debris of human lives dragged into the earth. There was nothing. I looked down into the crater. The walls were vertical, plunging down into absolute darkness. The air rising from the void was freezing cold, a stark, terrifying contrast to the 100-degree heat of the desert surface. It smelled of ancient, undisturbed stone and that sharp, chemical tang of ozone. "It took them all," Dale whispered, his voice completely devoid of its usual steady strength. "The whole town. Just swallowed them whole." I looked to my left. The rusted metal sign for the Ocotillo Springs gas station, which used to read Unleaded 199, was cut perfectly in half. The steel support pole had been sliced down the middle with surgical precision. The half that remained on solid ground was untouched. The other half simply didn't exist anymore. "This isn't a geological event," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "This is an excavation. Something is harvesting the surface." Before Dale could respond, the deafening, subsonic roar returned. But this time, it wasn't coming from beneath our truck. It was coming from behind us. I spun around, looking back up the highway we had just traveled. The asphalt was vibrating so violently it looked like the surface of a boiling liquid. The painted yellow lines shimmied and danced. "Back in the truck!" Dale roared, his survival instincts finally overriding the shock. "Reverse! We have to go back!" We scrambled back into the cab. Dale threw the transmission into reverse and hit the gas. The tires shrieked, struggling for grip on the vibrating asphalt. But as the truck lurched backward, the road behind us simply ceased to be solid. I watched through the side mirror in abject horror. Without a single crack, without a sound of crumbling stone or tearing earth, a 50-yard section of the highway behind us instantly liquefied. The solid blacktop and the pale limestone bedrock beneath it turned into a churning, gray slurry. Dale hit the brakes just in time. The rear tires of the truck skidded to a halt mere inches from the newly formed edge. The liquefied earth swirled and churned for a fraction of a second, and then, just as quickly as it had melted, it vanished. The gray slurry dropped straight down into the earth, leaving behind another perfectly circular, bottomless shaft. We were trapped. We were sitting in a 6-ton county utility truck, parked on a sliver of intact highway, no more than 40 feet long. In front of us was the massive, acres-wide crater that had consumed Ocotillo Springs. Behind us was a new, sheer-sided void. To our left and right, the desert scrubland had also dropped away, leaving us stranded on a tiny, precarious island of asphalt suspended over an unknown abyss. Dale killed the engine. The silence that followed was suffocating. The subsonic hum had vanished completely, leaving the valley basin cloaked in an unnatural, dead quiet. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. I opened my door and stepped out onto our tiny island. I walked to the rear edge and looked down. Same vertical walls, same smooth, porous gray stone, same freezing air rising from the depths. "We're cut off," I said, stating the terrifyingly obvious. Dale grabbed his heavy steel thermos from the cab, unscrewed the lid, and took a long drink of water. His hands were remarkably steady now. The panic had passed, replaced by a cold, calculating pragmatism. He was assessing the situation, treating the impossible nightmare like a collapsed trench or a broken drill string. "We have water for 2 days if we ration," Dale said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "We have the emergency flares in the toolbox. We wait for Vince to realize we haven't reported back. He'll send a chopper." I looked out across the massive crater that used to be a town. "Vince doesn't know about this. He thinks we're dealing with a pothole at the intersection. By the time he realizes we're missing, by the time he gets the state to authorize a helicopter over this airspace." I didn't finish the sentence. We both knew the math. Suddenly, a plume of dust caught my eye on the far side of the massive crater. Through the heat distortion, nearly a quarter-mile away across the void, a vehicle was speeding down the intact section of the highway, approaching the destroyed town from the opposite direction. It was a white Ford pickup truck with a flashing amber light bar mounted on the roof. The county seal was painted on the door. "It's Vince," Dale said, squinting against the glare. "He must have driven up the back access road from the interstate to check on our progress." The white truck was moving fast, completely unaware that the town it was driving toward no longer existed. "He doesn't see it!" I yelled, waving my arms frantically over my head, even though I knew there was no way he could spot me across the distance. "The heat shimmer is hiding the drop-off! Stop! Stop the truck!" Dale sprinted to our toolbox, threw the lid open, and grabbed a red emergency flare. He popped the cap, struck the igniter, and held the brilliant, sputtering red flame high in the air, waving it in wide arcs. Across the crater, the white truck's brake lights suddenly flared. Vince had seen the edge. The truck skidded wildly, kicking up a massive cloud of dust, fishtailing across the highway before finally coming to a halt, dangerously close to the precipice. The dust settled. Through the distance, I saw the driver's side door open. Vince stepped out. He was a small man, usually dressed in a crisp polo shirt and khakis, looking entirely out of place in the rugged backcountry. Even from a quarter-mile away, I could read the frantic, terrified body language. He walked to the edge of the crater, looking down into the abyss, then looked across the impossible distance to where Dale and I stood on our tiny island. He raised his arms, gesturing wildly. I could see his mouth moving, shouting something, but the vast expanse of the void swallowed his words completely. "Stay back from the edge, you idiot," Dale muttered, lowering the burning flare. Vince turned back toward his truck, reaching into the cab, likely grabbing his radio to call for help. That's when the earth decided to take him. It happened in absolute silence. There was no deep, subsonic hum. There was no violent vibration. There was no warning whatsoever. I watched through the shimmering desert heat as the solid asphalt beneath Vince's boots simply ceased to be a solid. The pavement, the dirt shoulder, and the bedrock beneath his truck instantly transformed into that gray, churning slurry. Vince didn't even have time to wave his arms. He didn't stumble. He just dropped straight down into the liquefied stone, sinking instantly beneath the surface like a heavy stone dropped into a calm lake. The heavy white county truck followed a fraction of a second later, plunging hood first into the churning gray mass. And then, the slurry froze. In the blink of an eye, the liquefied earth hardened back into seamless, pale gray bedrock. The surface was perfectly flat, completely undisturbed. There was no hole, there was no debris, there was no truck, and there was no Vince. The earth had simply opened, swallowed them whole, and sealed itself shut without leaving a single trace. Dale dropped the burning flare onto the asphalt. It sputtered and hissed, casting a weak red glow against the blinding afternoon sun. We stood on our crumbling island, surrounded by bottomless voids, staring at the blank, seamless stone where a man had existed just 5 seconds ago. The subsonic hum began again, vibrating the soles of my boots, and this time, it was coming from directly beneath our island. I froze, my eyes locked on the crumbling asphalt between my feet. The vibration wasn't just a sound anymore, it was a physical pressure, a localized gravity that felt like it was trying to pull the iron out of my blood. The island of asphalt was maybe 40 feet long and barely 20 feet wide, a jagged chunk of highway suspended over absolute nothingness. Dale realized the danger immediately. He didn't look down at the void. He looked at the truck. The heavy, 6-ton mass of the county utility rig was sitting right in the center of our fragile platform. Even with the diesel engine dead, the sheer density of the metal, the cooling block, the heavy suspension, it all seemed to act like a magnet for whatever was generating that frequency beneath us. "We have to move," Dale said, his voice stripped of all emotion, reduced to raw, mechanical survival. "We can't stay near the rig. It's a target." I looked around frantically. There was nowhere to go. To our left and right, the desert scrubland had fallen away into the abyss. In front of us was the massive crater that used to be Ocotillo Springs. Behind us was the new void that had swallowed the highway. We were completely isolated, marooned on a sinking ship of stone and tar. But Dale was already moving. He walked to the back edge of our island, ignoring the dizzying, sheer drop, and pointed down toward the right corner. When the county had blasted this highway through the valley decades ago, they had cut through a natural spine of elevated limestone. The blast walls on either side of the road were gone, swallowed by the voids, but a narrow, jagged ridge of the original bedrock remained intact just below the level of the asphalt. It connected the back corner of our stranded island to the sloping wall of the main valley. It was a natural bridge, no wider than a city sidewalk, suspended over the freezing black depths. "Grab your water," Dale ordered. He unhooked his heavy canvas tool bag from the side compartment of the truck, dumping out the heavy steel wrenches and drill bits onto the asphalt. They clattered loudly, the sound flat and dead in the unnatural silence of the valley. He stuffed 2 emergency flares and a coil of nylon rope into the empty bag. "Leave the gear, leave the radar. We cross that ridge before this piece of pavement turns into soup." I grabbed my plastic canteen from the cab, my hands trembling so violently I nearly dropped it. I slung the strap over my shoulder and followed Dale to the edge. Looking down at that narrow spine of rock made my stomach heave. The drop on either side was absolute. The darkness down there was so dense it felt heavy, like looking into an ocean of black ink. The air rising from the depths was frigid, carrying the smell of ancient unbreathed earth and that overpowering metallic stench of ozone. It clashed violently, with the 104-degree desert heat baking the surface, creating bizarre, swirling microdrafts that whipped the white limestone dust into miniature tornadoes around our knees. "Don't look down," Dale said, stepping off the asphalt and onto the uneven, jagged limestone ridge. "And Hutch, don't march. Keep your steps irregular. Break your rhythm." I understood instantly. The phenomenon was harmonic. It was tracking patterns. The steady, rhythmic thrum of the diesel engine had drawn it to us like a moth to a porch light. If we walked in a steady, predictable cadence, we might generate enough of a rhythmic frequency to trigger another liquefaction event right under our feet. I stepped onto the rock. The limestone was chalky and brittle. Pieces of it broke off under the heavy tread of my boots, tumbling silently into the dark. I waited to hear them hit the bottom, but the sound never came. I forced myself to walk like a drunk, taking a long step, then a short, shuffling half step, dragging my foot, pausing randomly. It went against every natural instinct of human locomotion. My muscles burned with the effort of fighting my own balance. The heat was agonizing, It was 104 degrees in the shade, and out here on the exposed plateau, the sun beat down like a physical weight. Sweat poured into my eyes, stinging blindly behind my polarized lenses, baking into a crust of salt and pulverized limestone on my skin. I kept my eyes fixed on the back of Dale's sweat-stained shirt. He moved with a slow, deliberate clumsiness, navigating the uneven terrain with the grim focus of a man walking through a minefield. It took us 20 agonizing minutes to cross a distance of maybe 200 feet. When Dale finally stepped off the narrow ridge and onto the solid, sloping hillside of the main valley wall, he collapsed onto his hands and knees, his chest heaving. I stumbled up behind him, practically crawling up the incline until I was sure there was solid earth stretching out in front of me. I rolled onto my back in the dirt, gasping for air that felt too thin, too hot to actually fill my lungs. We didn't speak for a long time. We just lay there in the baking dirt, listening to the absolute suffocating silence of the valley. But we couldn't stay on the low ground. We needed to see the extent of the damage. We needed to know if there was a safe route back to the interstate, or if the entire world had simply caved in while we were looking the other way. Dale pushed himself up, his joints popping loudly. "We need high ground," he rasped, pointing up the steep, scrub-covered slope of the valley wall. "We need to see what we're dealing with." I nodded, forcing myself to stand. My legs felt like they were made of wet sand, a terrifyingly appropriate comparison given what we had just witnessed. We began the climb, using the brittle branches of dead creosote bushes to pull ourselves up the incline. The higher we climbed, the more the valley basin revealed itself through the shimmering heat distortion. When we finally reached a flat plateau near the crest of the ridge, I turned around to look out over the basin. I expected to see the desert stretching out, scarred by the two massive holes we had narrowly escaped. I expected a localized disaster zone, something that could be mapped, measured, and eventually cordoned off by the state. What I saw broke something fundamental inside my mind. The valley was gone. The entire basin, stretching for miles toward the hazy purple silhouettes of the distant mountains, was a honeycomb of destruction. It wasn't just Ocotillo Springs. It wasn't just the highway intersection. The desert floor was pockmarked with dozens, maybe hundreds, of perfectly circular, sheer-sided voids. They overlapped in places, creating massive, figure-8-shaped chasms that dropped into infinite blackness. I looked toward the north, where the old, main mining town of Blackwood was supposed to sit at the base of the foothills. Blackwood had a population of maybe 3,000 people. It had a hydroelectric substation, a massive concrete processing facility, schools, and grid streets. There was no town. There were no buildings. There was no concrete facility. There was only a cluster of massive, interlocking black circles cut into the pale earth. The scale of it was incomprehensible. It looked like a microscopic image of a cellular structure, or the porous surface of a bone, magnified to a planetary scale and carved into the crust of the earth. "Dear God," Dale whispered, taking his weathered ball cap off and wiping a dirty sleeve across his forehead. "It's all gone. Everything." My mind frantically tried to apply geometry, physics, structural engineering to the vista of absolute ruin. It was useless. Nature doesn't work in perfect circles. Nature doesn't carve 90-degree vertical shafts thousands of feet deep without leaving a single pebble of debris. This wasn't erosion. This wasn't a tectonic shift. It was a systematic, mathematical erasure. We were standing on a crust of earth that was being actively, intelligently digested. The sheer insignificance of our existence washed over me in a wave of cold dread. We build our roads, our houses, our entire lives on the assumption that the ground beneath our feet is a passive, permanent foundation. But it wasn't. It was just a thin skin, and something beneath it was hungry. I turned away from the edge, unable to look at the honeycomb of voids any longer. As I scanned the rocky plateau we were standing on, trying to slow my racing heart, a flash of faded yellow metal caught my eye. Bolted to a large, flat slab of exposed limestone about 50 feet away was a rectangular steel box, topped with a small, dust-covered solar panel. I recognized it instantly. It was an automated county seismic monitoring station. The State Geological Survey had installed dozens of them across the alpine backcountry decades ago to monitor minor fault line activity near the old mining tunnels. "Dale," I said, pointing toward the yellow box. "Seismic station." I didn't wait for him to respond. I jogged over to the steel enclosure. As a geotechnical inspector, I carried a universal keyring on my belt that granted access to county utility boxes, water mains, and monitoring stations. I fumbled with the heavy brass keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably, until I found the right one. I shoved it into the padlock, twisted, and threw the heavy steel door open. Inside, the equipment was old, but functional. There was a digital transmitter module, its indicator lights completely dark, likely fried by the same electromagnetic interference that had killed our phones. But beneath the digital unit was the analog backup. It was an old-school drum seismograph. A heavy roll of grid paper was slowly feeding across a rotating cylinder, while a delicate, ink-tipped stylus scratched a continuous line across the surface, recording the vibrations of the earth in real time. The paper roll was still moving. The ink was still wet. Dale walked up beside me, staring down at the machine. "Can you read that?" he asked, his voice low and tight. "It's my job," I replied, pulling a small pen flashlight from my pocket to illuminate the moving paper in the shadow of the steel box. I leaned in, tracing the ink line back along the paper roll, reading the history of the Earth's movements over the past 24 hours. My professional training kicked in, a desperate attempt to impose logic on the impossible reality we were trapped in. "When a tectonic plate shifts, or a fault line slips," I explained, tracing a finger over the air above the paper, "the seismograph records a chaotic event. You get primary and secondary waves." The ink needle jumps wildly, creating sharp, jagged, unpredictable spikes that slowly taper off as the kinetic energy dissipates through the crust. "It looks like random static." I pointed the beam of my flashlight directly at the ink line recorded on the paper. "Look at this," I said, my voice trembling as the beam illuminated the ink. There were no jagged spikes. There was no chaotic static. For feet upon feet of the paper roll, the ink line formed a perfect, continuous, undulating sine wave. It was a smooth, mathematically flawless pattern of peaks and valleys. "It's harmonic," I whispered, the terrifying reality of the data sinking into my brain. "It's not an earthquake. It's a generated frequency, a sustained, rhythmic vibration." I looked at the timestamps printed along the margin of the grid paper. I traced the timeline back to 3 hours ago, right around the time Vince had called us about the missing intersection. The perfect sine wave showed a massive, sustained spike in amplitude at that exact moment. I traced it further back, looking at the previous night. There was an enormous, off-the-charts sustained wave that lasted for 20 straight minutes. "The town," Dale said, reading my expression. "That big spike last night. That's when it took Ocotillo Springs." "And Blackwood," I added, looking at a series of massive waves recorded days ago. "It's moving. It's targeting specific locations." "Targeting what?" Dale asked, his brow furrowed in deep, frustrated lines. "Why a gas station? Why a logging town? Why an empty intersection?" I stared at the perfect rhythmic waves on the paper, remembering the violent shudder of the steering wheel in Dale's hands. I remembered the heavy thumping pistons of our diesel engine syncing up with the ground. I thought about Ocotillo Springs, with its dozen modular homes, all running off a massive, centralized diesel generator behind the diner. I thought about Blackwood, with its hydroelectric substation and concrete processing plant full of heavy rock crushers and industrial turbines. "Mechanical output," I said, the words slipping out of my mouth as the horrific logic finally clicked into place. It's targeting rhythmic, mechanical vibrations. Dale stared at me, uncomprehending. The bedrock here is limestone, I explained, speaking quickly, the adrenaline surging through my system as the pieces of the puzzle aligned. Every physical object has a resonant frequency. If you match that frequency perfectly, you break the molecular bonds. Think of a singer shattering a wine glass. The frequency recorded on this paper is the exact resonant pitch required to instantly liquefy this specific type of limestone. I grabbed the edge of the metal box, my knuckles white. But whatever is making this frequency doesn't just broadcast randomly. It's blind. It hunts by feeling for vibrations on the surface. Rhythmic, sustained, mechanical vibrations. The power plant in Blackwood. The generator at the settlement. The heavy traffic lights swaying in the wind at the intersection. Our truck engine. It's an active digestion process, I said, looking at Dale, seeing my own terror reflected perfectly in his eyes. We build machines that hum and thump and vibrate in perfect rhythms. The earth feels it. It mimics the rhythm, creates the resonant frequency, liquefies the bedrock beneath the source of the vibration, swallows it, and then solidifies. It's eating our infrastructure. Dale looked out over the honeycombed valley, then back down at the yellow steel box. His pragmatic mind absorbed the rules I had just laid out, testing them for flaws, looking for a way to survive. Okay, Dale said, his voice deadly calm. Blackwood is gone. The generators are swallowed. Our truck is dead on that island. There is no heavy machinery running anywhere in this basin. It's completely silent. He pointed a thick, calloused finger down at the rotating paper drum of the seismograph. So why is the needle moving? I looked down. The delicate ink stylus, which had been drawing a flat, quiet baseline since the truck engine died, was beginning to twitch. It wasn't a massive, sweeping wave like the one that had swallowed the town. It was small, but it was growing. It was drawing a tight, rapid, perfectly rhythmic sine wave. I stared at the tight spacing of the peaks and valleys on the paper, trying to calculate the beats per minute. It was fast. Too fast for a diesel engine. Too fast for a turbine. Then, I felt it. The subsonic hum had returned. But it wasn't a deep, slow thrum vibrating through the soles of my boots anymore. It was a rapid, frantic, pulsing pressure that resonated directly inside my chest cavity. I looked at Dale. His chest was heaving. He was breathing heavily from the grueling climb up the ridge, his heart hammering against his ribs in a state of sustained, adrenaline-fueled panic. I pressed a trembling hand to my own chest. My heart was racing, pounding out a rapid, frantic, perfectly rhythmic beat. The frequency wasn't hunting machines anymore. The machines were gone. I looked back down at the seismograph. The ink needle suddenly slammed all the way to the right edge of the paper, scratching furiously back and forth, tearing the delicate grid paper. The earth beneath our boots began to soften, vibrating violently and exact, terrifying synchronization with the rapid beating of our own terrified hearts. The limestone plateau under our boots didn't crack. It didn't crumble, and it didn't give way with the chaotic rumble of a localized collapse. It simply lost its structural integrity in a wave of sickening, unnatural softness. The pale gray rock beneath my soles went from rigid, ancient bedrock to the consistency of a thick, waterlogged mattress in the space of a single second. The rapid, frantic scratching of the seismograph needle was completely drowned out by the thundering, erratic pulse hammering against my own ribs. The earth was matching us. The frequency wasn't hunting diesel engines or heavy turbines anymore, because there were none left in the valley. We were the only things left generating a rhythm. In the dead, absolute silence of the destroyed basin, our terrified racing heartbeats were the loudest mechanical output for miles. "Run!" Dale roared, his voice tearing through the suffocating heat. He didn't point back toward the destroyed highway or the treacherous, narrow spine of rock we had just crossed. He pointed south, toward a massive depression carved into the side of the mountain about a quarter-mile away, the old, abandoned rock quarry. It had been shut down and stripped of its assets since the late 90s. There were no active power lines, no idling generators, no heavy machinery left to hum or vibrate. Just dead, silent stone. If the phenomenon hunted by feeling for active, rhythmic vibrations, a place that had been dead for 30 years was our only hope for solid ground, we bolted. Every instinct I had honed over 12 years as a geotechnical inspector was screaming in protest. You do not run across an active subsidence zone. You move slowly, distributing your weight, testing the sheer strength of the soil with every step. But the rules of soil mechanics no longer applied. We were running across a crust that was actively shifting between a solid and a liquid state. The ground fought us with every stride. One foot would strike solid, unyielding bedrock, sending a jarring shock up my shin that rattled my teeth. The very next step would plunge ankle deep into a gray, churning slurry that sucked at my boot like heavy quicksand. The harmonic hum was everywhere now. It was pulsing in the stagnant air, vibrating in the chalky white dust we kicked up, and resonating deep within the marrow of my bones. It felt as though my own skeleton was trying to vibrate its way out of my flesh. The heat was agonizing. It was 104 degrees in the shade, and out here on the exposed plateau, the sun beat down like a physical weight. Sweat poured into my eyes, stinging blindly behind my polarized lenses, baking into a crust of salt and pulverized limestone on my skin. I kept my eyes fixed on the back of Dale's sweat-stained shirt. He was moving with a frantic, desperate energy, his heavy boots pounding in a regular, chaotic pattern into the shifting earth, trying to break the rhythm of his own panicked run. We were maybe 50 yards from the edge of the quarry property line, marked by a line of rusted, leaning chain-link fence posts. The ground was sloping downward now, funneling us toward the massive, stepped bowl of the excavation site. The panic was making us sloppy. Our breathing was heavy, ragged, and undeniably rhythmic. Our boots were striking the earth in a desperate, sustained cadence. The ground beneath Dale's right foot didn't just soften. It liquefied entirely. He pitched forward with a sharp, breathless grunt, his arms flailing wildly as he hit the deck. His right leg plunged straight down into the rock up to his knee. I slammed to a halt, nearly pitching over his sprawling body, dropping to my knees on a patch of stone that still felt reasonably solid. The limestone around Dale's trapped thigh wasn't broken rubble. It was actively churning. It was bubbling without heat, behaving like a thick, viscous fluid that reeked of raw ozone and crushed chalk. I scrambled forward, grabbing the thick canvas straps of Dale's high-visibility safety vest. I planted my boots as firmly as I could on the trembling crust and hauled backward with everything I had. "I got you!" I screamed, my voice tearing my throat raw. "Pull! Pull your leg up!" But the earth was pulling back. It wasn't a passive, muddy suction. The harmonic frequency was pulsing in rapid, violent waves, and the liquefied rock was reacting to the shifts in pitch. The slurry around Dale's leg would suddenly seize, instantly hardening back into solid bedrock for a fraction of a second, crushing his limb with unimaginable hydraulic pressure, before liquefying into a churning vortex again. Dale let out a short, choked gasp, his face contorting in absolute blinding agony as the stone seized around his calf. The bone snapped. I heard it clearly over the deafening hum of the earth. It was a wet, heavy, sickening crack that echoed in the hollow space of my own skull. "Dale!" I yelled, wrapping the canvas straps around my wrists to get better leverage, my boots slipping and sliding in the chalky dust. "Keep pulling! Don't stop!" The slurry churned violently, the gray fluid bubbling up around his waist now. The frequency was dragging him downward, pulling him into the subterranean void like a massive, invisible hand. I hauled backward, my shoulder joints popping, the muscles in my back burning with a searing lactic fire. I managed to drag him up an inch, maybe two, before the rock seized again, locking him in place like a vise. Dale stopped fighting. He stopped trying to claw his way out of the churning slurry. He lay flat against the vibrating rock, his face pale and dripping with sweat, his eyes squeezed shut against the agonizing pain of his crushed leg. When he opened them and looked up at me, the frantic terror was completely gone. The pragmatism had returned. Dale had spent 30 years sinking drill bits into the earth. He knew the absolute, unforgiving math of the job. He knew exactly what it felt like when a heavy steel drill string was hopelessly bound in a collapsed borehole, trapped by thousands of tons of shifting rock. You don't pull it out. You cut the line, or it drags the entire rig down with it. He reached down with a remarkably steady hand and unclipped the heavy plastic buckles of his safety vest. "Dale, no! Don't you dare!" I screamed, my voice breaking into a panicked sob. I tightened my grip on the canvas straps, refusing to let go. "I have you! Just hold on." "Let go, Hutch," he said. His voice wasn't a shout. It was a low, calm rumble that somehow cut perfectly through the deafening vibration of the earth. "It's seizing. You can't pull me through solid rock. You're just anchoring yourself." The slurry churned again, deeper this time, dragging him down to his chest. The ground beneath my own knees was beginning to soften, turning spongy and slick. Dale planted his massive, calloused hands flat against the center of my chest. He looked me dead in the eye, offering no apologies, no final profound words, just the hard, cold reality of survival. He shoved me backward with all his remaining strength. The sudden release of tension threw me off balance. I tumbled backward, rolling over the vibrating stone, the empty canvas safety vest slipping uselessly from my grasp. I scrambled frantically to my hands and knees, fighting the nauseating vertigo of the humming earth, trying to lunge back toward the churning pool. Before I could reach him, the harmonic hum reached a deafening, skull-splitting crescendo. The earth around Dale simply dropped. He didn't scream. He didn't reach out. He just slid silently beneath the surface, his eyes locked on mine until the gray slurry swallowed him completely. And then, the stone, instantly, seamlessly hardened. Where Dale had been a fraction of a second ago, fighting for his life in a pool of liquefied earth, there was only flat, pale gray bedrock. There was no seam. There was no crack. There was no depression in the stone. It was just an unbroken, flawless slab of ancient limestone, radiating a terrible, freezing cold. I lay there on the hot rock, my mind completely and utterly shattered. I pounded my fists against the solid stone where he had gone under, the skin tearing off my knuckles, screaming his name until my vocal cords bled and my throat gave out. I clawed at the seamless bedrock, desperate to find a fissure, a weak point, anything that could let me dig him out. But the stone was dead. It was just rock again. The violent vibration had stopped. The deep, subsonic hum faded away into nothingness. The valley basin was plunged back into that absolute, suffocating silence. I was entirely, terribly alone. I pushed myself up from the stone, my arms trembling so violently they could barely support my weight. My body was running on nothing but pure, unadulterated adrenaline, and the primal, hardwired instinct to put distance between myself and the threat. I stumbled forward, my boots dragging heavily in the dust, navigating the remaining 50 yards toward the rusted chain-link fence. I crashed through a gap in the twisted metal, the rusted wire tearing at the fabric of my shirt, and slid down the steep, rocky embankment into the abandoned quarry. The excavation site was a massive, stepped bowl carved deep into the side of the mountain. The walls were sheer cliffs of blasted limestone, terraced in wide, flat benches dropping down to a central dirt floor. It was utterly desolate. There were rusted, skeletal husks of old dump trucks half buried in the scree, and a dilapidated wooden processing shed sitting on a flat patch of packed dirt near the center of the pit. I dragged myself toward the shed, my boots kicking up small clouds of white dust that hung stagnant in the dead air. I reached the weathered wooden siding and collapsed against it, sliding down the rough timber until I hit the dirt. I sat there, pulling my knees tight to my chest, wrapping my arms around my legs in a desperate attempt to hold myself together. I gasped for air, my lungs burning. Every breath felt like inhaling ground glass. I closed my eyes, the image of Dale sinking silently into the gray slurry burning brightly behind my eyelids. I tried to force my breathing to slow down. I tried to suppress the chaotic, terrified hammering of my heart, pressing my palms against my sternum as if physical pressure could slow the frantic rhythm. I needed to think. I needed to apply logic to a situation that defied every scientific law I knew. The frequency targeted rhythmic mechanical output. It had taken the generators, the power plant, the truck. Then, when the machines were gone, it had locked onto the heavy, rhythmic pounding of our boots and our racing hearts on the ridge. The silence in the quarry was absolute. There was no wind whistling through the scrub pine. There were no birds circling the thermals above the cliffs. There was only the sound of my own ragged, desperate breathing echoing off the terraced walls. In, out. In, out. Heavy. Sustained. Rhythmic. The silence didn't last. Deep beneath the packed dirt floor of the quarry, the subsonic pressure began to build again. It started as a faint, localized tickle against the base of my spine. It wasn't the massive, sweeping hum that had swallowed the town. It was tight. It was focused. It was directly beneath me. I opened my eyes, a wave of absolute paralyzing horror washing over me. The frequency wasn't hunting the abandoned trucks. It wasn't sweeping the basin for heavy machinery. It was tracking the heavy, rhythmic heaving of my own lungs. My biology was betraying me. I was generating the very rhythm that was calling the earth to swallow me. I pushed myself up from the dirt, my legs screaming in protest, and scrambled toward the door of the wooden shed. I couldn't stop my heart from beating. I couldn't stop myself from breathing. I needed a way to break the rhythm. I needed a massive, chaotic disruption to shatter the harmonic frequency before it could lock onto my exact biological pitch and liquefy the ground beneath the shed. I kicked the rotting wooden door, the rusted hinges shrieking as it slammed open, and stumbled into the dim, sweltering interior. The air inside the shed was thick, with the smell of old grease, dry rot, and decades of undisturbed dust. Motes danced in the heavy shafts of sunlight, piercing through the collapsed sections of the corrugated tin roof. Workbenches lined the walls, littered with rusted tools and decaying rubber hoses. I scanned the shadows frantically, my eyes darting across the debris. In the far corner of the shed, bolted securely to the heavy concrete foundation slab, was a thick steel locker. It was painted a faded, flaking yellow, with a stenciled black warning label barely visible beneath the grime: explosives, mining charges, blasting caps, ammonium nitrate. If there was anything left in that locker, anything volatile enough to detonate, I could use it. I could wire the charges in an irregular, staggered sequence. I could create a chaotic, unpredictable seismic event. Raw, unpatterned kinetic energy would shatter the harmonic frequency, disrupting the perfect sine wave and freezing the ground before it could swallow me. I grabbed a heavy, rusted iron crowbar from the nearest workbench, the rough metal biting into the torn skin of my palms. I crossed the shed in 3 frantic strides and swung the iron bar, slamming it violently against the heavy brass padlock securing the locker's hasp. The impact echoed sharply inside the wooden walls. The brass lock groaned, denting under the force, but the hardened steel shackle held firm. I raised the heavy iron bar over my shoulder, preparing to strike again, putting every ounce of my terrified, desperate strength into the swing. My footing suddenly shifted. The solid concrete foundation slab beneath my boots didn't crack. It didn't buckle. It softened. The heavy wooden floorboards of the shed began to bow inward, groaning under their own tremendous weight. A wet, horrific sucking sound echoed from beneath the foundation as the rigid concrete slab turned to a thick, churning slurry. The subsonic hum amplified instantly, rattling the teeth in my skull and blurring my vision. It wasn't tracking heavy machinery anymore. It was tracking me. It had locked onto the frantic, terrified, rhythmic hammering of my own heart, and it was pulling the ground out from under me to get to the source. The heavy yellow explosives locker tilted forward as the floor beneath it gave way, the back legs sinking into the gray sludge that was already seeping up through the splintering floorboards. If that locker went under, I went under with it. There was no running away this time. There was no solid ground left to retreat to. The entire quarry floor was becoming a liquid trap. I raised the heavy iron crowbar over my right shoulder, ignoring the burning tear of the blisters on my palms, and brought it down with every ounce of desperate, animal strength I had left in my body. The iron slammed into the heavy brass padlock. The impact sent a jarring electric shock all the way up to my shoulders, but the lock held. The slurry was up to my ankles now. It didn't feel like mud. It felt like cold, wet cement, dense and incredibly heavy, actively pulling at the rubber soles of my work boots. The harmonic frequency vibrating through the sludge was deafening, a sustained, perfectly rhythmic pulse that perfectly matched the pounding in my chest. I swung the crowbar again. Iron screamed against brass. The hasp bent, the metal whining in protest, but it refused to snap. "Come on," I roared, the sound of my own voice barely audible over the planetary hum vibrating through my skull. I swung a third time, adjusting my angle, aiming for the mechanism itself rather than the shackle. The crowbar struck true. The brass casing shattered, the internal tumblers bursting outward in a shower of jagged metal fragments. I dropped the iron bar into the rising slurry and ripped the broken padlock away, throwing the heavy steel doors of the locker open. A wave of stale, chemical air washed over my face. The locker was packed with wooden crates and heavy canvas bags, all coated in a thick layer of undisturbed dust. I tore the lid off the nearest crate. Inside, packed in decaying sawdust, were dozens of cylindrical sticks wrapped in heavy, wax-coated paper. Commercial mining dynamite. It had to be at least 30 years old. The paper wrappings were dark and slick, weeping beads of highly unstable nitroglycerin. Under any normal circumstances, a geotechnical inspector would have cleared the entire grid and called in a specialized bomb squad just to look at this crate. The slightest impact, a sudden drop, or a sharp change in temperature could trigger a sympathetic detonation. But I needed an explosion. I needed a massive, violent release of kinetic energy, and I needed it right now. I reached into the crate, my hands trembling so violently I nearly dropped the first stick. I pulled out 6 heavily sweating sticks of dynamite, tucking them awkwardly under my left arm. I rummaged frantically through the lower shelves of the locker, the gray slurry now rising past my shins, the intense cold of the liquefied rock seeping through my heavy canvas work pants. I found a spool of det cord and a small cardboard box of copper blasting caps. My mind was racing, forcing the terror down into a small, dark corner of my brain, replacing it with the cold, hard logic of soil mechanics and acoustic physics. The phenomenon operating beneath me was harmonic. It relied on a perfect, sustained sine wave to break the molecular bonds of the limestone and turn the solid bedrock into a liquid state. It was a rhythm, just like Dale's diesel engine, just like my own racing heart. If you match a frequency, you amplify it. But if you introduce a chaotic, irregular, non-rhythmic wave of kinetic energy, you create destructive interference. You shatter the sine wave. You break the pattern. If I detonated these charges all at once, it would just be a single, massive thump. It might not be enough to disrupt the harmonic resonance. I needed chaos. I needed a staggered, unpredictable sequence of explosions that possessed absolutely no rhythm, no pattern, and no mathematical logic. I needed to create seismic white noise. I waded backward through the rising sludge, dragging the explosives onto a heavy wooden workbench that was still miraculously attached to the back wall of the shed. The building was tearing itself apart. The corrugated tin roof was shrieking as the walls warped and buckled, the structural timbers snapping like dry twigs as the foundation sank deeper into the earth. I pulled a folding utility knife from my pocket and flicked the blade open. I grabbed the spool of det cord. I didn't measure it. Measuring implies a pattern. I hacked off a length of cord that looked to be about 2 feet long. I hacked off another that was maybe 5 feet. I cut a third that was only 6 inches. I kept slicing, creating half a dozen fuses of completely random, irregular lengths. My hands were slick with sweat and the oily residue of the weeping dynamite. I carefully inserted a copper blasting cap into the end of each stick, crimping the metal with the heavy pliers on my multi-tool, praying that my shaking hands wouldn't accidentally spark the fulminate inside. I attached the irregular lengths of det cord to the caps, bundling the 6 sticks of dynamite together with a roll of heavy electrical tape I found on the bench. The shed lurched violently, dropping another 2 feet into the slurry. The workbench tore away from the wall, pitching forward. I grabbed the bundled charges, slipping and falling to my knees in the gray sludge. It was up to my waist now. The cold was agonizing, biting deep into my muscles, sapping the strength from my legs. The harmonic hum was a physical roar, a continuous, deafening pressure that felt like it was crushing my internal organs. I had to get the charges into the center of the liquefaction zone, deep into the earth where the frequency was concentrated, but I couldn't be in the slurry when they went off. The shockwave through a liquid medium would pulp my organs instantly. I looked up. The main crossbeam of the shed's roof was still intact, bowing heavily but holding together. I waded through the churning rock, fighting the immense downward suction of the slurry, and grabbed one of the vertical support posts. I hauled myself upward, my boots scrambling for purchase on the splintering wood, ignoring the rusty nails tearing through my shirt and slicing into my forearms. I dragged myself onto the heavy wooden crossbeam, straddling the timber just as the walls of the shed finally gave way. The entire structure collapsed inward, with a deafening roar of shattering wood and screeching metal, plunging into the gray vortex below. The roof dropped, but the crossbeam caught on the jagged, solid edge of the quarry floor just outside the liquefaction zone, leaving me suspended 10 feet above a churning, boiling lake of liquefied limestone. I looked down into the gray maelstrom. It was a perfect, flawless circle of liquid rock, swirling and folding in on itself, radiating that terrifying rhythmic hum. I took the bundle of dynamite, holding the loose ends of the 6 irregular det cords in my left hand. I pulled a magnesium emergency flare from my pocket, the one Dale had shoved into the canvas bag what felt like a lifetime ago. I struck the igniter cap. The flare burst into a blinding, sputtering crimson flame, spewing thick white smoke into the stagnant air. I brought the burning tip of the flare to the gathered ends of the det cord. The fuses caught instantly, hissing and spitting sparks as the internal powder ignited. I didn't hesitate. I threw the bundled charges directly into the dead center of the churning gray lake. The heavy bundle sank instantly, swallowed by the liquefied earth. I threw myself flat against the wooden crossbeam, wrapping my arms and legs around the splintering timber, burying my face against the wood, and squeezed my eyes shut. I opened my mouth, a desperate trick to keep my eardrums from bursting from the overpressure, and waited. The first explosion was a deep, muffled, subterranean thump. It wasn't a sharp crack. It was a massive displacement of kinetic energy deep within the fluid earth. The wooden beam beneath me bucked violently, throwing me inches into the air before I slammed back down. A fraction of a second later, the second charge detonated. Then, the third. There was no rhythm. There was no pattern. It was a chaotic, staggering sequence of violent shockwaves tearing through the liquefied rock. Thump. Thump, thump. Silence. Thump. Thump. The explosions sent massive geysers of gray slurry rocketing upward, showering the air with thick, heavy globs of liquid limestone that rained down on my back like wet cement. The air in the quarry was instantly vaporized, sucked away by the expanding gas of the detonations, leaving me gasping in a total vacuum for a terrifying second before the atmosphere rushed back in with a deafening thunderclap. But I wasn't listening to the explosions. I was feeling for the hum. Beneath the chaotic roar of the detonating dynamite, the perfect, sustained harmonic frequency of the earth was shrieking. It sounded like a massive, metallic grinding, a terrible, agonizing screech of a machine tearing itself apart. The irregular, staggered shock waves of the explosives were colliding with the perfect sine wave of the phenomenon, creating massive, unpredictable spikes of destructive interference. The rhythm was broken. The final charge detonated, a massive, shallow blast that blew a crater in the surface of the slurry, sending a shock wave through the air that shattered the remaining corrugated tin of the shed's roof into flying shrapnel. And then, the earth seized. It didn't happen slowly. It was instantaneous, violent, and absolute. The harmonic shriek was abruptly cut off, replaced by the deafening, catastrophic sound of millions of tons of liquid rock flash freezing back into a solid state in a fraction of a second. The sound was like a glacier cracking, a booming, echoing fracture that shook the very foundations of the mountain. The wooden crossbeam I was clinging to was suddenly locked in place, the ends of the timber trapped in the newly solidified stone. I lay there for a long time, my ears ringing with a high-pitched whine, my body trembling uncontrollably. I was covered head to toe in thick, gray limestone slurry that was rapidly hardening into a stiff, chalky crust on my clothes and skin. I tasted copper and dust in my mouth. Slowly, agonizingly, I pushed myself up onto my hands and knees, balancing on the heavy wooden beam. I looked down. The churning, boiling lake of gray slurry was gone. The perfectly smooth, circular void was gone. In its place was a chaotic, jagged, violently scarred landscape of solid bedrock. The chaotic explosions had disrupted the phenomenon while the earth was in transition, freezing the liquefaction process mid-churn. The rock was thrown up in sharp, jagged spikes, deep fissures, and frozen waves of stone. It looked like a photograph of a stormy ocean, instantly petrified into pale gray limestone. There was no subsonic hum. There was no vibration. There was only the dead, heavy, absolute silence of normal, passive earth. I had broken the rules, and I had broken the machine. I slid off the wooden beam, my boots hitting the jagged, uneven surface of the newly frozen rock. My left ankle screamed in protest, twisted from the fall, but it held my weight. I began to walk. I didn't worry about my rhythm. I didn't worry about my heartbeat. The frequency was dead. The earth was just earth again. The climb out of the quarry was a blur of physical agony and mental exhaustion. The sun had begun its descent, casting long, stark shadows across the terraced walls of the excavation pit, painting the white limestone in shades of bruised purple and burnt orange. My hands were torn and bleeding, the heavy crust of dried slurry pulling at my skin with every movement. My mouth was so dry my tongue felt like a piece of swollen felt, choking me. I didn't think about Dale. I couldn't. If I allowed my mind to process the image of him sinking silently into the gray void, to process the fact that his body was now permanently entombed in the solid, seamless bedrock miles below my feet, my mind would fracture, and I would never make it out of the basin. I locked the grief away in a tight, heavy box in the back of my head, focusing only on the mechanics of survival. Place a hand. Find a foothold. Pull. Breathe. Repeat. When I finally crested the rim of the quarry and hauled myself back up onto the flat plateau of the desert floor, the temperature was beginning to drop. The blistering heat of the day was giving way to the rapid, biting chill of the high alpine evening. I stumbled blindly across the scrubland, navigating by the distant, jagged silhouette of the mountain range, aiming for where I knew the main interstate had to be. I walked for hours. The moon rose, casting a pale, silver light over the desolate landscape, illuminating the endless, perfect black circles that honeycombed the valley basin. I gave them a wide berth, refusing to walk anywhere near the sheer drops, terrified that the harmonic hum might suddenly return and swallow me into the dark. Sometime around midnight, I saw the lights. They weren't the warm yellow glow of a distant town, because there were no towns left. They were the harsh, sweeping beams of high-intensity halogen spotlights cutting through the darkness, accompanied by the low, steady thrum of heavy diesel engines. I staggered toward the lights, my legs finally giving out as I hit the gravel shoulder of an intact stretch of the main access highway. I collapsed into the dirt, waving my arms weakly as a massive, armored convoy rolled into view. It wasn't the county sheriff. It wasn't the state troopers. It was a line of heavy, matte black military transport vehicles, flanked by armored personnel carriers. The lead vehicle slammed on its brakes, the heavy tires skidding in the gravel, illuminating me in the blinding glare of its high beams. Men poured out of the transports before the trucks had even fully stopped. They weren't wearing standard military fatigues. They were dressed in sterile, unmarked black tactical gear, and their faces were obscured by heavy, full-seal rebreather masks. They didn't shout commands. They didn't ask if I was okay. They moved with a terrifying, rehearsed efficiency. 4 men grabbed me, hauling me off the gravel and dragging me toward the back of an armored medical transport. I tried to speak, tried to croak out Dale's name, tried to tell them about the frequency in the liquefied earth, but my voice was nothing more than a dry, unintelligible rasp. They threw me onto a stainless steel gurney inside the brightly lit transport. A medic in a white hazmat suit immediately drove a heavy needle into my arm, hooking me up to an intravenous bag of saline. Another man, wearing a sharp, dark suit beneath a heavy tactical vest, stepped into my field of vision. He didn't have a name tag. He didn't carry a weapon. He held a sleek, black digital tablet. "Geotechnical Inspector Hutchinson," the man in the suit said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. "You are suffering from severe dehydration, heat exhaustion, and mild shock. You will be stabilized and transported to a secure facility for debriefing." I swallowed hard, forcing a tiny amount of moisture into my throat. "The earth," I croaked, staring up at the sterile white ceiling of the transport. It liquefied. The town, Ocotillo Springs. Blackwood. It swallowed them. The frequency, it hunts vibrations. The man in the suit didn't blink. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look at me like I was a raving lunatic suffering from desert delirium. He simply tapped a few commands into his digital tablet, his face a mask of absolute, bureaucratic indifference. "Inspector Hutchinson," he said, his voice smooth and meticulously calm. There was no frequency. There was no liquefaction. The Alpine Valley Basin has suffered an unprecedented, catastrophic subterranean gas collapse due to century-old, undocumented mining tunnels. The structural integrity of the entire region failed simultaneously. It is a tragic, natural geological disaster. I stared at him, the cold realization washing over me, chilling me far deeper than the freezing air of the subterranean voids. They knew. They already knew exactly what was happening out here. They had a cover story prepared. They had unmarked military convoys ready to roll. You don't mobilize a specialized, Black Ops containment unit for a natural sinkhole. You mobilize them to quarantine a phenomenon you cannot control, a phenomenon you are desperately trying to hide from the rest of the world. "Dale is dead," I whispered, the tears finally breaking through the dust and grime crusted on my face, burning hot against my cold skin. "Vince is dead. Thousands of people in that valley are gone. Thousands of tragic casualties in a massive geological collapse," the man corrected me, leaning in closer, his eyes flat and dead. "And as a geotechnical expert employed by the county, your official report will confirm this. You will sign non-disclosure agreements that carry the weight of federal treason. You will receive a generous medical discharge and a pension that will ensure you never have to work another day in your life. You will go home, Inspector, and you will never, ever speak of this valley again." He didn't wait for my answer. He tapped the medic on the shoulder, and a second later, a warm, heavy darkness flooded through the intravenous line, pulling me down into unconsciousness. That was 4 years ago. I took the pension. I signed the papers in a windowless room in a facility I couldn't locate on a map if my life depended on it. I let them write the official report that blamed old mining tunnels and subterranean gas pockets. I let the world believe that Ocotillo Springs and Blackwood were just unfortunate footnotes in the history of natural disasters. What else could I do? Tell the truth? Go to the press and tell them that the earth beneath our feet isn't dead rock, but an active, intelligent machine that occasionally wakes up to harvest our cities when our mechanical noise gets too loud? They would lock me in a padded room before the broadcast even ended. I quit my job. I sold my house in the suburbs. I sold my car, my tools, everything that tied me to a permanent location. I live in a heavily modified, vintage 1980s camper van now. I spend my life moving. I never stay in one state for more than a week. I stick to the coastlines, to the soft, sandy beaches, or the deep, muddy swamps of the South. I avoid the mountains. I avoid anywhere with deep, solid limestone bedrock. But my paranoia dictates far more than my geography. It dictates every single second of my existence. I never let the van's engine idle. If I stop at a red light, I turn the ignition off. If I'm stuck in traffic, I pull over to the shoulder and shut it down. I refuse to generate a sustained, rhythmic mechanical output for more than a few minutes at a time. I don't listen to music with a heavy beat. I don't use a washing machine. I don't use a blender. I don't own a watch that ticks. I break my own rhythms constantly. When I walk, I force myself to limp, to drag my foot, to pause randomly, just like I did on that narrow spine of rock over the abyss. I sleep in erratic shifts, 2 hours here, 4 hours there. I never let my body settle into a predictable, measurable pattern. Because I know the truth. I know that human science is a comforting lie we tell ourselves to feel safe in a universe that doesn't care about us. We measure soil shear strength and tectonic plates and fault lines, pretending we understand the rules of the planet we live on. But we are just insects crawling across the skin of something vast, ancient, and entirely incomprehensible. We build our massive cities, our humming power grids, our thumping diesel engines, broadcasting our presence into the deep earth, oblivious to the fact that something down there is listening. Something that hates the noise. Something that views our infrastructure not as progress, but as an infection that needs to be cleanly, surgically excised. I spend my nights lying awake in the back of the van, parked on some desolate stretch of dirt road miles away from the nearest town. I lie there, in the absolute quiet, holding my breath, pressing my hand hard against my own chest, terrified of the steady, rhythmic beating of my own heart. Because every once in a while, in the dead of night, when the world is perfectly still, I can feel it. Just a faint, barely perceptible tickle against the soles of my feet, a deep, subsonic vibration rising up from the dark earth, searching for a rhythm to lock onto, waiting for the perfect moment to open up and swallow us all.